Soy tu morada, sos vos, soy yo, soy la que sufre, soy la que parten en pedazos, la que venden como mercancía descartando a los rebeldes. Soy la que ensucian y envenenan diariamente. ¡Ay! Llegó Son de Pueblo.
Aquí somos Pachamama, somos quienes te defienden y arriesgamos nuestra vida y regamos con sangre tu corazón y tus entrañas.
Sembramos muchas semillas para nacer de nuevo convertidas en millones, clamando por justicia que casi nunca llega.
Madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
madre tierra,
Nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
quien te sacrifica y te convierte en mercancía. La minería asesina que nos quita el agua y la vida.
La siembra de monocultivos se hacen dueños unos pocos de la tierra que se siembra. Nos dicta el mercado que el consumo extremo es la salida.
Que nos vende el agua, nos vende la montaña, nos vende el aire y hasta nuestra libertad.
Porque la madre tierra es nuestra casa, defendámosla, Son de Pueblo.
Madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
madre tierra,
Nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
Fuimos rechazados, fuimos criminalizados por organizar la lucha. A este pueblo no lo escuchan.
Nadando contra corriente nos vamos a cuidar y defender la madre tierra. Su cuerpo que da vida y su vida que es la mía.
Madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
Madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of our Share Love, Share Lent virtual gatherings. That wonderful music video that you just saw was produced in part by Fundación Eric Radio Progreso, the partner that we will be featuring tonight as part of our discussion about DMP's approach to community development. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Emily Lukasik, and I am very grateful to be DMP's relatively new animator for Central Ontario. One of my favorite things about working for DMP is that I get to bring my faith to work with me every day, which is very special. So on that note, I'd like to begin this gathering, as we do all of our gatherings, with our land acknowledgement and prayer. We would like to acknowledge the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and directly adjacent to Haldimand Treaty territory. We also recognize the contributions Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here and reaffirm our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. And now I would like to call upon Sister Jean from the Sisters of St. Joseph, Toronto, whose video sadly is not working, and Sylvia from the Toronto Diocesan Council to lead us in our opening prayer.
Creator God, we remember your faithfulness and love. Grant us grace to enliven our relationships in mutuality, interdependence, and empowerment of others. Help us to see more clearly that the one who has called us will strengthen us. May we, in faithfulness and solidarity, bring the loving compassion and mercy of our God to our needy world. As Jesus walked along the seashore and noticed Peter and Andrew, James and John, and others, through the Spirit, he discovered his ministry was not his alone, but was a ministry in community. He gave his community a prayer. So now let us say that prayer as it has been expanded upon by campesino communities in Colombia. Our God, who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come.
Because when your kingdom comes, there is safety for everyone. There is no fear of walking on your earth. Respect for autonomy is recognized everywhere. The land is cultivated for the purpose of life and never, ever for the purpose of war and death.
Your will be done.
That there may be freedom for all, that the yoke of oppression may be broken. For your will is the proclamation of the gospel to the poor, comfort for the afflicted, for all those who have suffered war, landmines, and injustice.
Give us this day our daily bread.
The bread that makes us able to walk in the fields without a landmine killing us. The bread of healthcare and education for our people. The bread of living in peace and tranquility without threats and fear that afflict us and besiege the welfare of our community.
And forgive us, O God,
for not knowing how to share the bread you've given us,
as we forgive those
who have taken your bread from us.
And lead us not into temptation,
the temptation of believing that all is lost, that we can do nothing, the temptation of giving up, the temptation of believing that we can do it all on our own.
But deliver us from evil.
From the threatening forces of darkness that seek to destroy our way of life. From the division manifested among us as a result of fear and hopelessness, weakening our unity.
For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sister Jean and Sylvia. This year's Share Lent campaign invites us to celebrate different aspects of the work of development and peace each week. Last week, we learned more about DMP's unique philosophy when it comes to humanitarian aid. And this week, we're looking at our approach to community development. When describing this second branch of DMP's international work, I like to start with this well-known proverb. I'm sure you've heard it. Give a man or a person a fish, they have food for a day. Teach a man to fish, they have food for a lifetime. Now, Development and Peace likes to take this proverb and take it one step further, asking the more important but less comfortable question, why don't they have fish? The answer is often not that they don't have fish, and it certainly isn't that they need us to go and teach them how to fish. But as we saw in that wonderful music video, it's because corporations have taken advantage of their land and resources, polluting their water and killing their fish. Challenging the unfair systems that pollute someone's water is a lot more complicated than teaching someone how to fish. And so it's for that reason that you'll often hear community development referred to as long-term development because it is exactly that, long-term. It can take years to see the impact of our work in, say, reducing gender-based violence in Afghanistan or strengthening community development in Madagascar. And for that reason, to be frank, long-term development is a lot harder to sell. The results can be less tangible. It can take far longer to even see those results. And there's less of a sense of urgency to those problems, even though they are just as important. And it also forces us to confront the ways in which we ourselves contribute to those unfair systems. How do we contribute? By the very ways in which we live our lives, where we shop, what we eat, how we get around. For example, the jewelry we might be wearing could have very well come from a mine like we saw in that video. I told you it was less comfortable. Comfortable or not, as Catholics, we are not just called to charity, but to solidarity. And that is why long-term development is a fundamental part of our work at Development and Peace. And in my biased but humble opinion, what sets us apart from other not-for-profits. So now I would like to invite Mary Durran, Development and Peace's Latin American Program Officer, to speak a bit more about our work with community or long-term development in Honduras and its intersection with humanitarian aid.
Thank you, Emily. Well, good evening, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to say that Development and Peace has been working in Honduras since the 1960s, initially accompanying and supporting the work of missionaries from Quebec. There's a picture of Honduras, where it is in Central America. And we stepped up our presence in this country after Hurricane Mitch in 1998 killed more than 7,000 people and swept through the country, destroying infrastructure, communities, crops, and people's homes. In response, Development and Peace worked to support a network of community-based grassroots organizations who would organize to rebuild the country, putting into practice our humanitarian relief principles of 1, sustainability, i.e. that the initiative must leave lasting beneficial impacts to strengthen people's resilience. Secondly, participation, the people must be active participants in their own development. And 3, capacity building, the initiative must reinforce the capacities of local organizations and reduce their dependency on the outside. The grassroots community organizations throughout the country that were formed in the wake of Hurricane Mitch still exist today, and many are still active within our long-term development program in Honduras. It was Hurricane Mitch and the Honduran government's response to the catastrophe that were precursors to the current situation in the country. Pushed by the international financial institutions, the Honduran government moved to exploit its mineral resources and approve new mining legislation to attract investment. Mining companies, many of them Canadians, started to flock to Honduras to exploit its metallic mineral wealth. The word got round that Honduras had lax environmental regulations, that social organizations weren't organized to resist mining, and that mining companies could operate here cheaply and make big profits. So for the next few years, companies such as Goldcorp flocked to Honduras. They damaged the environment, they polluted water supplies, they corrupted local authorities, they evicted communities from their lands, and they repressed dissent. 23 years on, Honduras has one of the highest number of mining concessions, either in operation, under exploration, or in the process of approval. In September 2019, there were 471 metallic and non-metallic mining concessions. If we add the small-scale and artisanal mining projects, as well as some illegal mining projects, there are nearly 800 mining projects throughout Honduras, covering close to 5% of the national territory. Honduras is slightly larger than the US state of Tennessee. Many of these projects are on the lands of indigenous peoples, of Afro-Honduran communities. Almost all of them are on the lands of poor small farmers. In almost no cases were the communities consulted before mining companies showed up. The original occupants of these lands, the poorest of the poor, are the most marginalized and discriminated against. To the state and the wealthy business elite, these people are worth nothing, and even though laws do protect them, they're often not applied, and often wealthy investors with connections to the government will bribe the courts. So an important part of our work today is to accompany and support the communities who are defending their lands from predatory mega projects in mining, but also increasingly hydroelectric and solar power projects. The concessions are given out with no transparency, usually to members of a business elite. Our work is based on informing the communities of their rights under Honduran laws and international treaties, and supporting leaders in their work to inform populations and contest concessions in court. It is very important that the communities must be the protagonists in defending their lands. It's their struggle, and to work in this way to defend their rights reinforces their dignity. To defend lands, though, however, and environment in Honduras is dangerous work. The organization Global Witness documented that in 2019, Honduras was the most dangerous country in the world for land and environmental defenders. So without further ado, as I know that Jose Mario is going to go into this in more detail of the dangers faced by land and environmental defenders, I'm going to pass you over to Jose Mario Lopez, a member of the territorial defense team of the Fundación Eric, Radio Progreso, two Jesuit organizations who merged a few years ago.
And just before we pass it over to Jose Mario, I want to quickly just go over the interpretation feature on Zoom, because for some of us that might be a new thing. So just quickly, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says interpretation. So when you click it, you should get three options: off, English, and Spanish. If you don't speak Spanish, like me, you'll want to hit English so that in real time the presentation will be translated for you. Let's just quickly try it out. If I were to say, ¿Cómo estás?
How are you? My name is Emily.
Hopefully you would have just heard the interpretation live fed to you of that in English. If you have any problems, you can always direct chat with Webinar DVP or with myself, and we'll do our very best to help fix that. Also, if any questions come up during the presentation that you hope we can answer later, please submit them using the Q&A button on your screen. And now, without any further ado, please welcome Jose Mario Lopez.
Buenas tardes.
Good evening to everyone from Honduras. Emily and Mary gave a very complete introduction of what Honduras is. The map shows us in the center of America. That's why we're in Central America. And we're in a very strategic but complicated situation. I am going to speak very briefly of the context and what is happening in Honduras, but also what is the work that Eric Radio Progreso is doing in this context in Honduras. So the context of Honduras. So I will show two images to start off that show us the beauty, the natural beauty that we have in the country, with the mountains, with the rivers, with the sea, with the villages, with the natural beauty that is mixed together with human beauty. In Honduras, we have 8 indigenous communities. We are more than 8 million in Lenca communities, Calicinas, that are part of this ancestral wealth and this human richness that we have, and at the same time, this natural richness that we have. So what is happening right now in Honduras? Basically, if we move on to the next slide, what is going on in Honduras now is a crisis, a an accumulation of crises, we can say. As Mary mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, there was Hurricane and on top of the pandemic, this pandemic that is global, the pandemic only came to show and deepen the crisis that we were already accumulating historically in Honduras. Now, what kind of crises do we have? We have the crisis of corruption and impunity. To give us some data, Honduras, according to the transparency, we're at 24 on 100. The closest to zero you are, the more corruption it means there is in the country. And to name a couple of cases, to give an example, we've had funds that were used for political campaigns. So recently with the pandemic, there was an overvaluation for the help of hospitals. The money never arrived, and these hospitals aren't actually functioning. And so these are cases of corruption that are pretty impressive. Another situation in Honduras is the high level of unemployment and poverty. More than 60% of the population lives under the poverty line. And on the other hand, there is also a frailty of the state. There is no separation of powers of the state. They are all the power is concentrated in the hands of one person, who is the president and the executive power. And at the same time, the latest cases show us the participation of members of the police and the army in drug trafficking. So this is what's going on. And also the mining, the issue of mining, where our natural resources have become a strategy of removing these natural resources for outside gains. For, as we said earlier, there was a map of Honduras. If you could see on that map of Honduras, all those dots, those are all mining projects that have been approved or are in the process of being approved. There were more than 500 mining projects. And you can see that almost the whole country is covered by mining companies. And some of these projects, these extractive, are also linked in places where there is water or they're on ancestral lands, and the people were not consulted. So what this map shows us is that this climate of violence and of territorial conflicts has been increased right now. So that's why in the latest reports, we are in 2020, we are still, unfortunately, the most violent country per capita for land and environment defenders. Many were killed in 2020. So all these cases were documented by Global Witness, and this number of mining concessions end up causing criminalization of the defenders. And when that is not enough, they use violence and they make them disappear. And that is what happened to many land defenders in Honduras. And if that wasn't enough, we can finish this context with November 2020, where we suffered, all of Central America, but especially Honduras and Nicaragua, the Eta and Iota hurricanes. And you can see here the images of these phenomenons that were one week after the other. So because of the lack of planning and because of so much vulnerability, the impact was catastrophic. You can see here the Valle de Sula in the northern part of the country, which is one of the most productive zones of the country, was absolutely destructed. And if we move on to the next pictures, you can also see an aerial picture of the results, the and those who suffered the most, suffering not only of the coronavirus, but of all the floods that happened in November 2020, were, of course, the poorest communities that live on the shores of the rivers. And we don't have the exact data, but we still have people who are living on the streets because their their territories are not livable yet. So that's the story of the hurricanes Eta and Iota in November of last year. So if we move on, we can ask ourselves how, within this context, how do we work? What do we try to do? How do we accompany, as Eric and as Radio Progreso, the land defenders? First of all, we don't do it alone. We do it in network. We do it with others, with institutions, with community organizations, and with the communities as such, to be able to respond to these demands brought up by this context. And the last thing I wanted to share with you was to talk to you about the hurricanes Eta and Iota, which brought the creation of a network, a local emergency and solidarity network. This network was created by many organizations of the church and the civil society, a few businesses. And what we tried to do was to be able to respond to the emergency, because the state institutions really have no credibility to be able to bring the help to those who need them, because there's too much corruption, and in the international aid, international cooperation, other governments do not trust in the government of Honduras. So we've been trying to organize support from outside, but also support locally to be able to accompany and support these populations that were affected by the hurricanes Eta and Iota through this emergency and solidarity network that is still working now. And we're still working on three aspects. First of all, emergency relief. People needed food because their houses were flooded. They didn't have anything to eat. They were in shelters with a lot of more people without any help or preventing of the spread of the pandemic, because the pandemic became second, third priority. People had to leave. And one of the first things that this network was able to bring was food and aid. And another part, as you can see in the top left picture, was communication through Radio Progreso, with a lot of TV stations that weren't able to work, or the internet was gone. Radio was able to reach people where, even if there wasn't electricity, they had radios with batteries where they could hear information and they were able to find their family members. And another thing is that we work on the reconstruction of the protection of the rivers so that they don't flood again. And another was to support the agricultural workers who lost their land and lost their means of production. So that's what we were trying to do with the Emergency and Solidarity Network. One of the other ways how Eric and Radio Progreso works is through training and analysis. And how do we do this? If we can go to the next image, we do it through the analysis of the realities and of socio-pastoral, socio-political analysis in communities, but we also put at the service the media communication like Radio Progreso, but also all the other platforms in order to be able to give a voice to those who have no voice, those who are excluded, and to be able to talk about issues that often are not part of the mass media because it doesn't interest them. So from the radio and from the work that in Eric, we try to bring this training and through our media communication and our direct participation in the communities. There's also another experience with the youth. We are a country where more than 50 or 60% of the population is under 35 years old, where most are youth that are unemployed. So the other thing we work on is research, social research, to be able to understand the phenomenons, but mostly to be able to find solutions within the communities. The research is done with the community and goes back to the community to be able to find solutions. There's other things like public opinion surveys that are done every year, or NBO, which is a magazine that is published every 3 months on issues like the environment, like consulting, democracy, and other issues on which we do research and we share the information with the communities. After this comes political training, political education. And so we have our training schools on politics and citizenship. And so we're bringing to youth from about 8 or to 10 departments of the 18 that we have in the northwest parts of the country. Since 2008, we've been doing these training schools on politics and citizenship for youth from 18 to 35 years old. We've had more than 600 youth participate, youth from the church, from environmental groups, from student organizations, from women's groups, and youth who really want to change the country. So this is another experience that has really been very positive, and the fruits aren't at the short term, but we hope that this political training for the youth will help us to open paths to find solutions to the issues of the context that I was explaining at the beginning. Now, for on the topic of the environment, to go more on the theme of mining, there are 3 concrete cases that we're going to mention to understand how this is happening in Honduras. And for this, we'll be able to watch a small video that shows the struggle of the community of Guajunol defending the rivers against a mining company. So if we can play the video.
La resistencia de Guapinol continúa. Ilegalmente, el Estado otorga una concesión minera en el Parque Nacional Carlos Escaleras, antes Montaña Botaderos. La empresa Inversiones Los Pinares contamina los ríos Guapinol y San Pedro. Las comunidades se organizan y reclaman. El Estado reprime y criminaliza. 32 ambientalistas acusados. Los primeros 14 fueron juzgados en tribunales de alta peligrosidad. 13 fueron declarados inocentes. 1 continúa preso. Ahora 9 ambientalistas más enfrentan el mismo proceso. ¿Por qué el Estado trata como criminales a estos ambientalistas? ¿Qué hay detrás?
El caso Guapinol es un caso emblemático a nivel nacional porque está develando cómo opera todo el sistema administrativo, toda la corrupción y las ilegalidades que cometen las instituciones del Estado como Mi Ambiente, ICF, Ingeomin, para el otorgamiento de estas licencias ambientales y estos concesionamientos de los territorios.
Muchas gracias. Y el caso,
Thank
aquí
you very
está.
much. So here you have the picture. There are 8 land defenders that have been more than 17 months in prison waiting for their court case to start. And what did they do? They were defending the rivers. And as mentioned, there is a criminalization process to intimidate those who defend the environment. So they've been in jail for 17 months for defending the Guapinol and San Pedro rivers. And the case of Guapinol shows everything behind it, how first they approve a project within a national park, and there was a sentence from the American court that accuses them because of the assassination of an environmentalist, and they approve this mining project at the center of the park, where the sources of water for this community start, and and then they intimidate those who defend the river. So there's a selective justice. The environmentalists are criminalized as people who are fighting against the state, and the cases of corruption that I mentioned at the beginning, nothing happens. They've been let free. They've had no repercussions for what they do. And if we move on to another case, which is the case of Loganicina, you can see that in July 18th, 2020, in the community of Triunfo de la Cruz, 4 Garifunas have been disappeared. It's been 7 months since we haven't known where they are. One of them is the president of the community, and they've taken roads. They've given visibility to their situation. The Garifunas are one of the traditional Afro-Honduran communities, and they've been disappeared for more than 7 months, and with a state that has given no answers, they've decided to organize and to set up an organization to look for them with national and international human rights organizations, because still 7 months later, we still do not know where these 4 Garifuna leaders who were kidnapped in the early morning with the help of the national police. That's what's happening. Then there's been no response of what happened, where they are, and they are still disappeared. And a case also that has been known internationally, the case of Berta Cáceres. Tomorrow, well, on March 4th, it was Berta Cáceres' birthday, and 5 years ago, on March 3rd, she was assassinated in her house. And so we're talking about 5 years of impunity. We do still now, after 11 months in court against those who have been accused of shooting her. We're going to start in April to go against the co-author, the president of the Aguasarca mining project, trying to get justice to the co-authors, to try and get the intellectual authors. Such a case that is well known internationally, and still total impunity. So there's a historical debt and huge impunity that happens in our country today. There were ecumenical activities. There's going to be a virtual concert at 7 in the evening here in Honduras in solidarity to celebrate the memory of Berta Cáceres, but also demanding justice. It's been more than 5 years now without real justice for her family and for the people. And to finish, because I'm running short on time, I would like to finish with a few experiences of resistance, some positive experiences. Because there is no justice in the country, the organizations have to go outside of the country. And that's why the IDH court has two sentences against the state of Honduras in Triunfo de la Cruz and in Punta Piedra, because the state of Honduras sold the ancestral lands of the Garifuna. So there is a sentence from the Human Rights Court to give it back. And also there's the Declaration of Municipalities Free of Mining, where the state was condemned for not guaranteeing the protection of the defenders of the environment. There's also municipalities that have declared themselves as free of mining and extractivism, and a self-declaration and self-determination of the indigenous peoples according to the international treaties. And there are today platforms and social organizations that influence the search for institutions that guarantee the human rights in the country, because the government is not doing it. This country that, as I mentioned at the beginning, violates human rights and where there is no independence of the different powers. So within all this, there is resistance, and there are organizations that still believe that we can change the reality of the country from within with national alliances, but also international ones. And I'll finish with a phrase from Pope Francis in Laudato Si. And I think that it helps to resume the context of Honduras, but it also shows a little what might be the path for change, the path for solutions that would not be short-term changes. There'll be medium and long-term changes. We are celebrating 200 years of the independence of Honduras from the Spanish crown. So the question is, what independence are we talking about? So I'll end with this phrase from the Pope that Laudato Si reminds us on the last slide, please. We are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. This is in the Laudato Si from Pope Francis, and like we always say in our institution, we are in a sprint of resistance, in a race for resistance. We're always saying we're in a race of resistance, a long marathon. It's not a sprint, because if we go too quick, we get tired. It's to move slowly, to create alternatives and proposals, but to also bring in the different generations of the country. So I'll end here. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I am here to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jose Mario. That was wonderful. So we have a couple questions for you and for Mary that I'm going to just hopefully be able to read in English, and we can get it translated for you. I know that Mina has answered in the chat that there are around 800 mines in Honduras, some of which are illegal. Is there any chance that you know how many of those are Canadian owned?
Bueno, no tenemos un dato. Creo que es una de las debilidades.
I think that is one of the flaws, not of the organizations, but the fact that the state, through the institutions that regulate the mining industry, the Geology and Mining Institute, don't give that information. There's been a presidential decree through which the information of the owners and the companies that are financing the mines in the country not be spread. There's a law of official secrets that guarantees the protection of this information so that civil society organizations do not have access to this information as such. And we know cases like Mary mentioned at the beginning, Gold Corp, in the Valle de Siria, or there was also Canadian money in mines in Guasacualpa, but we can't be sure because when one looks for this information with the state, we don't receive the information because it is covered by the law of official secrets. And there's a decree, an executive decree that forbids sharing this information with the communities. So this really limits the work that can be done at the international level because we don't know who is financing these more than 800 mines. Some are extracting, some are in exploration, and others have just land contracts. But there is really an institutional policy of not sharing the information. So it's very difficult to have the exact information of the participation of Canadian capital, but it's the same for the United States or other European countries that also participate.
Could I just add to Jose Mario's comments? I remember when I first went to Honduras with Development and Peace back in 2007, there were a lot of Canadian mining companies then on the ground because it was much easier for them then to operate. But several things have happened since. I mean, the price of mineral resources has gone down, so it's been less interesting for them to operate there. Secondly, communities are much, much more aware of their rights, and they make it much more difficult for companies to come in, because before they used to just go into a company and I mean, it was a total surprise for people. People didn't know what was going on and it just caught them unawares. That's no longer happening because there is a lot of awareness now about mining. And another observation, I was in Honduras in early 2020. And one thing that struck me was that just how many sort of irregular and small scale mines that there are now compared to what there used to be. And I saw far less evidence of big formal mining companies, but much more kind of get rich quick schemes when somebody who's connected to the elite, they'll get a concession, which is to mine one. And one that I visited with the Fundación Eric and with Jose Mario was a barite concession, which was in Yorito. And it seemed to be like a kind of a small, almost family-run operation. You know, when someone connected to the elite manages to set up a small-scale mining operation and they think they're going to get rich quick. I mean, I've seen much more evidence of this type of mining in the last few years. So I think the trends are changing to what they used to be.
Thank you. And our next question is from and she is wondering, for those who have been able to become free of the mines, how did they do that? I'm sure that's a very complicated question, but.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you very much for the question. Normally, you would do it through a law for the municipalities, so the lay of the municipalities. There's a part of participation and consulting that happens. It's a popular assembly where the municipal authority consults to see if people are in favor or against the mining project. And after this process of organizing and training that has had some success, people go and defend their territory and have been able to win these small fights that are more of a declaration than anything. But At the same time, there's another law that is the mining law, and they're at the same level. So what is approved with one law doesn't necessarily apply directly on what's happening with the mine. It's a more of a process of organizing the civil society and all, but because a municipality declares itself free of mines, it doesn't mean that the mines actually leave the territory. That sovereign local decision through a local municipal law isn't respected by the states. So these declarations of territories free of mining is a step, but it doesn't really mean that the mining companies leave these territories. They're still there, and they're still having an impact on the communities because the communities are abandoned, so they're easy prey. Uh, the companies will bring in the light, they'll fix the streets, they'll fix the small hospital in the village, so they're buying the goodwill of the people. So although there is a declaration from part of the municipality, it doesn't mean that the mining company leaves. We have the case of the hydroelectric project in Aguasarca, for which Berta Cáceres was killed. It didn't mean that the hydroelectric project left. No, they stayed. They changed hands many times, but they were still there. So this is a declaration. It's only one step. It's important to do it, and it's important to share the information so that many communities can organize and say no to the mining companies. But it's only one step. Another thing they do is that they block the highways so that the machinery can't make it to the mines to deteriorate the water sources or the tops of the mountains. So it's really the law of the strongest, because if you remember at the beginning, I was telling you, we do not have really a state that gives rights. And by having a concentration of power in very few hands, the projects have an authoritarian power where they're brought down by executive powers. And in this case, the police and the military play the role of not protecting the citizens, but mostly to oppress them, put them in jail, and even use violence against them instead of protecting society. So we're really left to our own in front of that. So we need to organize, the civil society needs to organize to see how we can stop these projects that are really going to destroy our environment. And so, yes, it is a win in a way to make these declarations, but it doesn't mean that the mining project leaves. And so it's complicated, but yes, they are important steps in defending our territory.
In many cases, in the cases of international mining companies, when it's too much trouble to operate, they'll often go to another country, because when they see that civil society and communities are becoming too organized and it's too much of a problem to get in, or they're actually forced to do an environmental cleanup that costs money, then they'll think, well, we'll go elsewhere, somewhere else where it's easier. And there are a lot of countries in the world that have mineral resources and where it's easier and cheaper to operate than Honduras is, and where there's less resistance from the communities. So I think that does make a big difference.
And it looks like we just have time for one more question. I apologize for typing while you were responding. I wanted to make sure we could address all of the questions. And so can you speak maybe more specifically to how development and peace has played a role in helping Honduras overcome these difficulties? If you could describe that a little bit more.
Yes, I mentioned it in the presentation that was very quick, and I'm sorry about that. But one of the things that Development and Peace has been helping on is training in two ways. I mentioned it, these political training schools for the youth. that have been initiatives that Development and Peace has supported and promoted, and others have been at the level of international solidarity, especially when it comes to extractive mines. We have Honduras, countries that have pretty high levels of development, and so Canada invests a lot in extracting in Honduras and in other countries, and tax human rights in a way that they wouldn't do in their own country. It's easier here to invest and to destroy the environment and to make more money on the backs of the population. So it's an unequal struggle between countries. And I think that Development and Peace has been able to be a bridge to give visibility both within Canada, but also in other international networks, and in particular in the church networks. And so I think that it's been an important participation to be able to show the actions of the Canadian companies, and even sometimes the state, and sometimes the population doesn't really realize the impact of these companies. We could speak of many topics of training, political training, environmental training, human rights training, and some publications as such. But on this line of training from one hand, but on the other hand, the international visibility and solidarity, which is important, so that we don't just stay in our small Honduran bubble, but that we go beyond, and that we're able to not only globalize issues, but also globalize solutions and answers.
That's awesome. What a wonderful note. I'm just looking at the time to leave on tonight. So thank you so much, Jose Mario. It is an absolute joy to have you with us tonight. Before we officially close, I'm just going to share my screen one more time to share two more things with you. The first is our Share Year Round program. This is an incredibly helpful way for you to support these kinds of long-term development projects like we were just talking about, because monthly donations, however small, allow us to do just that, plan for the long term. And as I'm sure you've heard, now is definitely the time to do this because of that wonderful matching program, $130,000 of matching funds from 8 religious communities across Canada, up to $130,000 for any new or increased Share Year Round donation from now until Pentecost Sunday. So if you want to use that link, or I've already noticed that Minas is super on the ball and throwing those into the chat as well. And our last reminder is that next week's weekly gathering looks a little bit different than the first 3. It is our national Think Fast. So if you want to stand in solidarity with those who go hungry every day and join us in celebrating our work with youth engagement, you can join students all across Canada, a bilingual, national, virtual 25-hour fast. It is sure to be wonderful, and you can pop in and out for any part of it. Check out that link to register and to get more information. On that note, I'd like to wrap up by thanking, first and foremost, Jose Mario. It is such a treat to have you with us. To thank Mary, Sylvia, and Sister Jean, Alianka, and Estella for their help with interpretation and translation. I want to thank Stephanie and Minas for their behind-the-scenes magic. And of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us today in our Lenten gathering. And I've decided, in lieu of a closing prayer, we're going to close by replaying the video that we opened with. I invite you to reflect on the powerful words and images in this video, and to think about the different ways that we can all better care for Madre Tierra, Nuestra Casa Común.
Soy tu morada, sos vos, soy yo, soy la que sufre, soy la que parten en pedazos, la que venden como mercancía descartando a los rebeldes, soy la que ensucian y envenenan diariamente. ¡Ay! Llegó Son de Pueblo.
Pachamama, somos quienes te defienden y arriesgamos nuestra vida y regamos con sangre tu corazón y tus entrañas.
Sembramos muchas semillas para nacer de nuevo, convertidas en millones, clamando por justicia que casi nunca llega.
Madre tierra,
Nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
madre tierra,
Nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
¿Quién te mata, madre tierra? ¿Quién te sacrifica y te convierte en mercancía? La minería asesina que nos quita el agua y la vida.
La siembra de monocultivos se hacen dueños unos pocos de la tierra que se siembra. Nos dicta el mercado, que el consumo extremo es la salida.
Que nos vende el agua, nos vende la montaña, nos vende el aire y hasta nuestra libertad.
Porque la madre tierra es nuestra casa, defendámosla, son de pueblo.
Madre tierra,
Nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo.
madre tierra,
Nuestra casa común,
madre tierra,
nuestra casa común,
defendámosla,
porque ya no hay tiempo,
defendámosla.
porque ya no hay tiempo.
No nos consultaron, fuimos rechazados, fuimos criminalizados por organizar la lucha. A este pueblo no lo escucha.